Adab, and welcome to Mishal. It's a special pleasure to be in conversation with you today. Your book has become one of my favorite books of all time about India and Pakistan, the subcontinent, but also about a memoir. But I have to begin with a personal note. I'm literally 1 degree of separation from being your mother, Shama's best friend. And that missing link is Meher Appa. Meher Khan Williams, who is the older sister of my closest friend, Seema. These webs of connections exist continuously, as you know. You know, one of my 8-year-old nephews, Jafar, got so upset with me and my sister doing this connection thing that he goes, even if somebody from Mars lands on Earth, you are going to say, oh yes, I went to school with your third cousin's best friend. We have inherited these kinds of webs. To be honest, it should have been Meher Appa in conversation with you, but she most generously abdicated in my favor, so here goes. The audience is going to think that it's an imposter sitting here unless I begin everything with a sher, right? So I was thinking about what sher I should start with, and it occurred to me how common our family backgrounds are. Your grandmother's father, so your grandmother is my generation. No, your mother is my generation, sorry. Your
Yes,
grandmother, Tahira.
You are younger than my mother, I will say that, Azra Raza.
Not really.
And I'm going to call you Azra Raza, whereas Meher Khala is very much Meher Khala to me.
So, your mother's grandparents have greatly in common with my parents. So my father was from Lucknow, and my mother was from Aligarh. And your mother's father was from Lucknow, mother from Aligarh. My parents were very deeply involved in the movement to make Pakistan, followers of Mr. Jinnah, the great leader, Quaid-e-Azam. And yet, after coming to Pakistan, and being the happiest they could ever be. My mother says the happiest day in her life was 14th August when she could touch the ground of Karachi. She said, none of the children being born gave me as much happiness as my setting foot in Karachi did. That was the kind of sentiment I'm giving you the background of. Yet they could never get out that trauma of exile. So I'll read you one sher by my uncle, Sayyid Azra Raza. चमन छूटा तो छूटा था, मजाक़े रंग व बू छूटा. This line is so beautiful. When I lost the garden, I lost not just flowers, but the very delight one takes in color and fragrances. And the line literally belongs to a particular genre of Urdu poetry called Sheher-Ashobi, where the lamentation is not just about mourning a city, but mourning a way of being. So, चमन छूटा तो छूटा था, मजाक़े रंग व बू छूटा, छुटी आदम से जन्नत और हमसे लखनऊ छूटा. बहुत खूब. This is the kind of grief that my parents felt. And then for your grandmother, Tahira, let me read one more sher. एक दिन तारीख के औराक में खो जाऊंगी. Because Tahira, Mishal's grandmother, also was deeply involved, of course, in the partition movement, etc., but then left her parents behind and used to go back and forth. And Lucknow remained in her blood also. एक दिन तारीख के औराक में खो जाऊंगी. One day I'll be lost in the pages of history. रफ्ता रफ्ता मैं भी अपना लखनऊ हो जाऊंगी. They could just never get over that trauma. So my second question will be about the book. But my first question is what Rainer Maria Rilke said, that a work of art is good only if it comes from necessity. So writing a book like this, which is both self-exploration and storytelling, I want you to do some internal reflection for us before we get into the book and tell me what you learned about yourself. What inner journeys did you have to make as a result of the book?
Yes, I knew that being interviewed by Azra Raza was going to be probably a much deeper experience than any other book interview I've done so far. And not one, I can tell you, in the year since this book came out in the UK has involved Sher Shairi at the beginning. So I'm very grateful to you for all the ways in which you are really unique. I would like to say at the start what a pleasure it is to be here with you all and for the collaboration between Asia Society and LLF. It's very close to my heart. I think it goes, right to the heart of why I wanted to write the book and how I hope it reaches people. And of course, to be interviewed by you is a great privilege. What I learned about myself, I think through writing this book, my starting point was that I felt that my grandparents' generation, born in the early part of the 20th century, had lived through an amazing time which has largely been forgotten by world history. And I live in the UK, I'm a British journalist, so I particularly felt it's been forgotten by the British when British policymaking is absolutely at the heart of what India and Pakistan and all of us in the diaspora are still experiencing to this very day, and indeed very acutely at this point in time. So I had this sense of my grandparents lived through, this was their life and times, and I want to capture it. And in many ways, I do not feature in the book, although I think that it is quite revealing of me because it tells you a lot about the way I've been brought up, and that in itself is quite an exposing thing. But I think what I learned more than anything else was that things that today can be boiled down very easily and very crudely into, well, the Hindus and Muslims were never really going to live happily with each other, and that this was a smart and neat solution for the time. When I really looked at this period of time, I realized how many junctions there were, how many moments where things could have been different. Had the people who had power, had they got on better, had they been able to talk in a deeper way to each other, had they been able to compromise. And I think it probably did change my understanding of the present day. And it did change my understanding of who I was, in the sense that when I found my Lucknow grandfather's 1932 passport, and his national status was recorded as British subject by birth, and I thought, I always saw him as a Pakistani. I mean, I knew he'd been an imperial subject, but he was actually a British subject by birth. So maybe I'm not the daughter of immigrants to the UK. Maybe I'm actually the granddaughter of people who were born British, even though they didn't come to the UK for many years. So I think this sense of, there was no concept of citizenship in that day. You were subjects, not citizens. But really, all our sense of identity is much more complex the further you go back. And I'll just say one more thing about this, which is that in an actual added twist to my sense of myself, this week in the UK, I featured in a documentary called Who Do You Think You Are, which is a series which also a version exists in the States, the Henry Louis Gates version. I'm not sure what it's called in the US. These are sister programs. And when I featured in it, they followed the story of my Anglo-Indian grandmother, Mary. And it turns out that her ancestors were American. They were from Massachusetts. They were the Farley family. They were at the forefront of 250 years ago, 1775, and people in Boston rising up against the British. They were at the forefront of that. One of that generation's grandsons moved to America in what we would call seeking his fortune, but today we would call economic migration. And he came to Madras in India, and had children and grandchildren, and those children and grandchildren are my grandmother's family. So actually, I discovered that way back when, there's nothing in me that would have ever made me think I have American ancestors, but I do, and they'd be amazed to think they've got a Muslim, descendant who looks and sounds nothing like them. So identity is very, very complex, and the more you find out, the more you feel that.
And when you start writing a book, like, for example, I was writing a book on cancer, and I was writing the stories of my patients. And, Mishal, once I realized that I am writing in such granular detail about their anguish and their suffering, then it felt to me insincere to hold back my story of having lost my own husband to cancer. So, as a result, I started adding my things. And once you do that, then it became like a red line going throughout the book, because everything from cancer patients became very personal. And with you, you started writing a personal book, but then it became very historical,
Yes.
social, etc. So my second question, which I warned you about, is now, and please take your time in answering this, because I want you to, I love this book, guys. You all have to really read it to realize I have a whole page of just quotations from the book. What a wonderful job you've done. Congratulations. The research that you've done is so thorough and so detailed that I could not imagine this is a BBC journalist. I felt like I'm talking to one of my academic colleagues who are going to kill me unless I've gone through everything with microscopic detail. But you do it, and you do it very well. So the question I have is, basically, take us into the journey of broken threads, starting with Jamila's shawl and how you really came about writing this book, and why now?
So I think why now is probably something to do with age. I'm 52, and I think about 3-4 years ago when I started writing this book, I think I did feel that my children, who are now young adults, 18 and 20, and I felt they didn't have much sense of their history before their grandparents arrived in the UK. And I felt, I'm a journalist, I've traveled the world, I've told so many people's stories. Often publishers have asked me to write something personal in a memoir, and I thought, I'm still not convinced that it's a moment for an autobiography or anything like that, but I do feel that there's something important in my family background which deserves to be recorded. So that was the starting point, and I thought, I realized that my 4 grandparents, Shahid and Tahira, were my mother's parents, and Mumtaz and Mary were my father's parents. And I realized that between the 4 of them, they actually come from quite a wide geographical spread of South Asia. My father's father, Mumtaz, a Muslim born in Multan in 1920, he married my grandmother Mary, who was from Vishakhapatnam, between Calcutta and Madras, present-day Chennai, so right over on the Bay of Bengal. That marriage came about because the nuns who educated her at the convent in Vizag said, there's a very good place in Lahore where you could study nursing. It's called the Mayo Hospital, and we think you should go there. And can you imagine, age 18 in 1938, she traveled 2.5 days by train across British India to come to Lahore, where she knew only one other person, that was a girl from the convent who had gone to do the same nurse training before that. And within a few months, she met a young medical student, and 2 years later, when they married, it was kept secret from both of their families. The marriage came about when they managed to find a priest and an imam, going from one mosque and one church to another in Lahore until they found two men who were willing to marry them. So you can imagine this. Their common language was English. They were different religiously, a Muslim and a Catholic, and she made her life in Pakistan. And then my mother's parents, exactly the mirror image of your family, Azra Appa, had left UP and come to Pakistan, and very much out of choice. They weren't refugees, but some of their family members in Lucknow did leave in refugee circumstances as conditions deteriorated. So I felt that this was a wide enough story that I could capture a range of different, I guess you could say ethnicities, but certainly languages and regional differences. So that was where I started from, and then actually it's my two grandmothers, Tahira and Mary, who are on the cover of the book, and so the device that I start the book with, though, is a piece of fabric. When I got married to Mishal, who's here in the audience. I say I got married to Mishal as if I've also been married to someone else. I haven't. He's the only one. And when we got married, one of my mother's cousins came over from Lahore, and she gave me this shawl. And the shawl had a beautiful border. And she said, it was a plain shawl, but with a beautiful border. And she said, when your grandparents got married in 1940 in Aligarh, all of the groom's sisters were given a sari to mark the occasion. And her mother was one of those sisters. And she said, the sari frayed over the years, but the border survived. And I've taken the border and I've edged it on this shawl for you. And it was the most meaningful present I received when I got married, because I thought, this is a piece of another wedding, my grandparents' wedding, but it's also incredible that it did survive the dislocation of independence, because Shameen had left Lucknow as a small child. Her mother had died, and someone in the family, probably her grandmother, had packed this sari. And so Shameen had inherited it. So I felt there was that's where the title Broken Threads came from. But through the story of my grandparents' lives, so they are coming of age in British India, and they certainly never thought that independence would come in their lifetimes, I don't think. Remember that New Delhi, where my grandmother Tahira was a medical student at Lady Hardinge Medical College in 1938-39, New Delhi was still being built at that time. It wasn't even inaugurated as the capital. Sorry, it was inaugurated as the capital of British India in 1931. It was being built in the time, in her childhood, when she came and went from Delhi. So when you see a grand new capital of the imperial presence going up, you don't really think it's all going to come to an end in such a short time. And there was a social mobility which that generation and that class benefited from, more opportunities in the British establishment, the army, the civil service. But they were trying to advance in the system to the extent that the system allowed. And they were very conscious that as Muslims, I'm talking about my three Muslim grandparents, that the community was behind in many ways. And Aligarh, which was where my grandmother Tahira was born, and which was important to my grandfather because he was a student there, was really a symbol of what led to the creation of Pakistan, but to Muslim social mobility as well. So I did start by thinking, I'm going to tell the stories of these four people, but then I realized I can't understand the decisions these four people made without understanding the full story of their times. So I ended up going back to 1857. So I ended up going very deep into the Second World War and the experience of the Indian Army in the Second World War, because it led to so many changes. I went deep into the INA and the force that turned to the Japanese in the Second World War. And of course, these crucial 2 years afterwards, 1945 to 1947, which my mother's parents saw at very close quarters because they were part of the circle surrounding Field Marshal Auchinleck, who was the Indian Army chief, but also the second most important official in British India after Mountbatten. And really the great untold story as far as Britain is concerned is that these two men at the forefront of power in India, the two top British officials, disagreed fundamentally about partition and independence, and Auchinleck thought Mountbatten was a fool and misguided and wrong and hasty and unqualified, really, for the job he was doing. So it did become a more political and historic book. And in fact, Mishal, as my writing continued, would see these piles of memoirs and Second World War diaries, and he'd see them piling up on my desk. And at one point he said to me, I thought you were just writing about your grandparents. What happened here? But I had to tell the full story, but then I also had to make it as accessible as possible. And that is really what I've tried to do. I didn't want to do academic history. I wanted the four people who I foreground to be characters through whom people like me or people who are interested in South Asia can have a relatively easy access point into difficult history.
Lovely, love your answer. Listen, I find the women in the book very compelling. And because they're growing up in Aligarh, where my mother was from, so I grew up with an Aligarh ethos myself and visited the city many times with my mother. Couple of things I want to point out. One thing that Mishal has also said in the book is that is a courtly culture. The manners and the kinds of courtesies one has to observe. There are 1,000 nuances behind everything. So, for example, you can't just say to some elder person, Apa. It has to be Apa Jan, Apa B, Badi Apa, Choti Apa, or Khala. I mean, you point out one of Achhi Khala. I'm Achhi Khala in my family. And I've asked the kids to drop Pupi and Achhi and just call me Achhi, not Pupi and Khala. But then another custom I want you to know is, when I was like a teenager, I asked my mother, how come you and all your sisters have gender-neutral names? Like Rafiq, Shafiq, Aziz, my mother is Zahir. And she gave a very nice answer. She said, well, the custom in our house was that when men arrived, they would have to call out from outside that they have arrived. So normally they would take the name of a son. Javed hum aa gaye. But if you didn't have a son, if you had a daughter, you couldn't take her name. So until you had a son, you had to name your daughters gender-neutral names. So my grandfather didn't have a son, so all four girls. I mean, I think those customs are so beautiful. But what I want to say is that the women, some of the women in your, especially your grandmother, I mean, Tahira is sitting in Aligarh in 1930s and reading War and Peace and literally most emancipated. But yet there are beautiful stories of Rahima and Amirun Nisa. I wanted you to talk about those two women for a few minutes because they are incredibly, Amirun Nisa is a woman who I found totally inspiring. And then Rahima, the unspoken, the unspeakable tragedy of her life. I want you to mention something.
Okay, so yes, absolutely. There is a thread of the changing lives of women throughout, and I think many of you will be able to relate to this. But for example, the difference between the education opportunities of both my grandmothers, who studied away from home, medicine and nursing, although both dropped out to get married, but they left home to study in the 1930s. So, and in the case of my Muslim grandmother, Tahira, this was pretty unusual. So there's a definite female emancipation and social mobility thread running through this book. But Amirun Nisa was my Parnani, so my great-grandmother, my grandmother Tahira's mother. And I knew her as a very old lady in my grandparents' house in Rawalpindi because after the 1965 war between India and Pakistan, my grandmother went to Aligarh and brought her grandparents to Pakistan because she said, I'm not going to be able to travel back and forth to see you anymore the way I have done since 1947. So my great-grandmother, I remember living in my grandparents' house in Rawalpindi when I was a little girl. And what I discovered, actually not through my immediate family, but as I asked more cousins, is that she grew up in a house in the old city of Lahore. And another common thread in the book is what happens when parents die young and what a terrible impact that has on children's lives and life chances, not only emotionally, but I mean the end of education, the lack of the exploitation by other relatives. And Amirun Nisa's father, when he died young, her mother and she and her siblings were at the mercy of their chacha and their uncle. And she and her sister and their mother would then buy unhusked rice and wheat in the bazaar in in Lahore, and they would hull it and husk it and do, with the charnowing, sifting, there's threshing, all this. And they would then sell it back into the bazaar. And that way they kept the younger brothers in school. And the younger brother, and of those younger brothers, one became a very well-known poet-philosopher. He was, younger than Allama Iqbal, but Khalifa Abdul Hakim is well-known in Lahore. And so, and I thought, gosh, this great-grandmother of mine, I had no idea. No one ever told me this until I started to look into it. And then Rahima is on the other side of my family, on the father's side, my father's side of the family. She was the cousin of my grandfather Mumtaz. They grew up together as the children of two brothers in the grandparents' house in the old city of Multan. And they were supposed, everyone had planned that these two children would get married. And my grandfather went off to King Edward Medical College in Lahore, met my grandmother, discovered a much bigger world, had suddenly realized he was supposed to marry his cousin and had the shock of his life and had no intention of marrying his cousin. And told his parents, and they kept fighting him on it. But he married my grandmother Mary, but what he didn't realize was that the word that his family put out in Multan was that he had married Rahima, and that Mary was his second wife, and that Mary was the wife who was with him, and Rahima was his wife back in Multan. So that meant that Rahima could never be married to anyone else. And so she lived her whole, she lived under the same roof, and I probably vaguely remember her as well. So because she was my grandfather's cousin, she was a part of their life forever. But it was that whole, this is not all culture. This is also about finances. It's a desire to keep an inheritance within the family. So it was also much easier for the marriage of the cousins. Then the woman is not taking her share of the inheritance to another family. So there are tangential characters, but they do have their own very resonant and often very sad stories. But of course, it's much harder to write about women because both my grandfathers wrote published and unpublished accounts of their life, and I relied on them a lot. But my grandmother, I relied on fragments of letters, a few audio tapes that she'd written. And then as far as my father's mother, Mary, was concerned, I have a living great aunt who's 101 years old, my great aunt Anne, who lives in Oldham in Lancashire. And 3 years ago, when I started writing the book, she was very much able to tell me, and she told me the story of losing their father early in life and how badly that affected their life chances. And it was really only the nuns who kept them in school.
Lovely. I really enjoyed those very much. One day I was complaining to a friend of mine, Arjuna Padurai, some problem at work and whatever. So he says to me, Azra, look, there's the A team, like Beethoven and Einstein and people like that. And then there's the B team. We are all the B team, Why worry about these little things? And that made total sense to me. And I wanted to say I have met two women in my life who I think are A team members. And the first one is Qurratul Ain Haider. And we are so lucky that Zeba Haider is in the audience, her niece. And the second woman is Sara Suleri Goodyear, who I absolutely worshipped. So I wanted to bring in Annie Appa for a minute, because you see, the book is a lot about partition, and you gain freedom from the British, but then the freedom means comes with a lot of separations of siblings and parents from children. And a lot has been written about the violence in the partition, the rapes, the pillaging, the bloodshed, etc., by our fiction writers like Manto and Khwaja Ahmad Abbas, Krishan Chandar, etc. But Annie Appa was the first to start writing about the quieter tragedies of the partition, the tragedies that had these social betrayals in them, And then at the personal level, I want to read a quotation from one of my favorite books by Annie Appa, Qurratul Ain Haider. It's from her book, Patchar Ki Awaaz. If you haven't read this book, people, please go home and read it. If you can't read Urdu, you can read the English translation done by C.M. Naeem. It's called A Season of Betrayal. And Annie Appa has written so movingly about the kinds of betrayals that happen. Let me just read you one quotation. What is this strange feeling? As if the land itself has become foreign, as if the soil beneath our feet no longer knows our names. The map was redrawn. Cities changed countries, hearts did not. These kinds of mournings and lamentations that come bring me to literally this final question, because I think we don't have that much time. And I have to end with poetry, just saying. But I'll just say one thing. Faraz is a great poet of ours who wrote something that I want to ask Mishal about, because in a way, my parents migrate to Pakistan, they're full of their mourning of exile, but then we migrate also. I come to America, Mishal goes to London, and so with these migrations, still I mean, you can't take Pakistan out of either of us. That is our identity. And Faraz Saab says it so beautifully, because we not only remember the good times, but what's happening and what has happened. He says, ओ देश से आने वाले बता, क्या अब भी हमारे गाँव में घुंघरू है हवा के पाँव में, या आग लगी है छाँव में? उस देश का प्यारा कैसा है, ओ देश से आने वाले बता. We cannot get over the trauma of these exiles. I want to ask you, do you think it would have helped our families and families of millions if we had had a truth and reconciliation commission of sorts, to be able to just tell our stories, get it off our chest, what happened, what those broken threads mean at personal levels?
You see, I think that my grandparents, your parents' generation, when millions of people have been through what you have, and also in the case of Pakistan, when you're trying to build a new country, it's, you know, what is your suffering compared to those who have lost even more? And then the other thing in Pakistan which complicated that is that it soon became very difficult to not be a son of the soil. This is a really terrible phrase, but you know, it soon became not the thing to do to emphasize that you or your parents had been born in somewhere that was not on the territory of present-day Pakistan. So these are all kinds of complexities that come into things. And certainly my nani, my grandmother, going back and forth to Aligarh in those years after independence, you know, my grandfather was told by Ayub Khan that, you know, Shahid, these trips of Tahira's to India, they don't look good. And he was saying out loud what other people were thinking, and the implication being it's not good for your career. And my grandfather, to his great credit, said, "Sir, I can't possibly stop her going to see her parents. I wouldn't want to, and I won't do it." But there is a price to pay. I think Meher Khala, you wrote in your book that you felt the same was the case for your father in the army. I will say that to add to the writers you mentioned, I'll also add Atiya Hussain, who I think has chronicled Lucknow in Sunlight on a Broken Column, and that there is poetry at the start of my book, which is Faiz Ahmed Faiz, Ye Daagh Daagh Ujala, Ye Shab-e Gazida Seher. And I think that I really do hope that people find something of themselves and their own history within this. But I certainly have wanted to capture not just the events of 1947, but an entire society that existed before and that came to an end at that time. And And of course, it's different for us because in places like New York and London and elsewhere as a diaspora, Indians and Pakistanis do meet and of course find so much in common. But of course, for the vast majority of people in India and Pakistan, this has not been possible. And clearly with the events now, it is not going to be possible for a very long time. And I was conscious that that was another reason I wanted to capture this, because my grandparents were the last generation who still, they had lived and worked and fought in the Second World War alongside people who they never saw again. And I will give you one snapshot of this, which is that in the 1965 war, the son of one of my grandparents' oldest friends was shot down over Pakistan. He became an Indian prisoner of war. He was the son of General Cariappa, later Field Marshal Cariappa. And my grandmother said, I heard that he was a prisoner in CMH hospital in Lahore, and it was, my instinct was to go to him, but of course I couldn't. He's a prisoner of war. And in the 1971 war, my uncle Jafar was a prisoner of war in India for 2 years. And one day there was a message in his prisoner of war camp in Bihar. I put this right at the end of the book, where a message comes to him and it says, this is a message for Major Jafar from Field Marshal Cariappa. Is there anything you need? And my uncle said, no, please send the message back to the Field Marshal. No, I'm fine. But he knew why. It was because Cariappa had found out that Shahid and Tahira's son-in-law was a prisoner of war in Ranchi in Bihar. And he reached out in the only way he could. And actually, since the book came out, some of the descendants of these individuals I have come to know. And it's been a beautiful and poignant experience. And I have also had the chance, while I didn't travel for the writing of this book, I have had the chance to go to Lucknow and elsewhere in India since. And when I went to Lucknow, I went to the graveyard where I knew that my great-grandfather and my great-aunt Jamila were buried. And I was looking for the graves, and there are these old gentlemen, this little mazar, this little shrine there, and they're watching me go back and forth. They're thinking, what is going on? And I said, Bahut purani qabr, the very old graves, where are they? And they said, well, from how long ago? And I said, Azadi se pehle, before independence. And they said, that's a very long time ago. But fine, as I went, and then after a while I said, to sort of explain what I was doing, I said, hum yahan se hote the. I thought that was the only way I could explain it. We used to be from here. And then very sweetly, one of these gentlemen said, Nahi, ab bhi aap yahin se hain. You are still part of this place. And then he gave me some flowers and said, go and scatter them on any grave and imagine that it belongs to your family. So I like to think that there are still, there is beauty and there is resonance to be found even in these difficult stories. And I will say that it is possible to get the ebook or the audio book as well as order the physical book from Canada or from the UK. So I hope that some of you might be able to access this, and who knows, it might also find a publisher here.
Thank you so much, Mishal. I've sort of made an executive decision to not have question answers here, but she'll be available outside. But before we end, I wanted to read a couple of quotations from the book. So one is, I found this very moving, that your grandmother Tahira, goes back to India to visit her parents and somehow arrives in the middle of the night in Aligarh. But she describes that when she gets off at the train station, there's nobody to receive her because her car had broken down and she arrives by train. But the tanga wala comes up and says, Bitya, aap bahut din dur rahi. You've come back after a long time. Where have you been? Imagine those kinds of connections that existed for Tahira, that Tangawalas know who she is. Or I think her best quotation from the book, Tahira's saying about the partition. It need not have happened had a majority listened to the ordinary demands of a minority. I thought this was very telling. And then you take your mother Shama to India not long ago, and the immigration officer looks at her passport and asks her mother, first time? and then give your mother's answer.
There was a long pause where my mother was thought, how do I answer this question? So she just said, she said, "Nahi, hum yahan aate the." We used to come here, and it's like, and there was just this sort of silence, and I thought she didn't really. It's like the rest was understood.
Yeah.
You know, it was just obvious.
That's
whole
what
background.
moved me very much, that the immigration officer didn't have to ask anything more. Your mother didn't have to say anything else except simply say, hum aate the. So that's our issue. Ghalib का एक शेर है कि जब मैं कदा छुटा तो फिर अब क्या जगह की कैद, मस्जिद हो, मदरसा हो, कोई खानका हो. But a contemporary poet, Rahi Masoom Raza, said something which I'd like to end with, which applies to both you and me because we are immigrants of sorts as well. But in the strange lands, we are constantly looking for some connections. So this is by Rahi Saab. अजनबी शहर के अजनबी रास्ते मेरी तन्हाई पर मुस्कुराते रहे. मैं बहुत दूर तक यूं ही चलता रहा, तुम बहुत देर तक याद आते रहे. फिर कुछ ऐसा हुआ, मैं बहुत थक गया, इसलिए सुन के भी अनसुनी कर गया. कितनी यादों के भटके हुए कारवां दिल के जख्मों के दर खटखटाते रहे. जहर मिलता रहा, जहर पीते रहे, रोज मरते रहे, रोज जीते रहे, और जिंदगी भी हमें आजमाती रही और हम भी उसे आजमाते रहे. अजनबी शहर के अजनबी रास्ते.